would have versus a naturalist. I'm not talking about a naturalist that goes out and looks at trees and birds. I'm talking about a person who believes that there's nothing but natural forces. Maybe another word would be a materialist. Just doesn't think that there is any such thing as a supernatural anything. And I put here the word presuppositions because, again, within the circles of scientists, you don't talk about faith. That's a religious term. That belongs in church. So they use the word presuppositions. That sounds more objective, and so we'll call it presuppositions. But notice the faith involved in these things, because none of them, on either side, can be proven from the sense of scientifically what we're talking about. A creationist would say miracles are possible. A naturalist would say miracles are impossible. Now that right there, can you prove a negative? No, it can't be proven. But that's the position they find themselves in. Miracles are impossible. And when we're talking about miracles, what we're talking about are supernatural things, things where the laws of nature are broken, not just amazing coincidences and things that we don't understand how it worked, but maybe there was some way that that car just missed me or whatever. You know what I mean? We're talking about supernatural events. They're impossible, according to the naturalist. Creationists would say God miraculously excuse me, a creationist would say God miraculously initiated the natural universe. So supernatural causes are responsible for then the natural effects we see in the universe. A naturalist would say all that exists is due to natural cause and effect. We can explain every single thing that we see based on a natural cause, no supernatural causes. And finally, a record of God's creative activity is in the Bible. This is a really important one, especially for a creationist like myself, because there are many brands of creation out there. And some don't really put a lot of credence into the record of Genesis 1 and so forth, but they still believe in creation of some sort. There must have been an intelligence designer out there doing whatever. But by faith, I, as a creationist, also believe that there is a record about creation. As minimal as it is, frankly, I wish there was more, but there is a record of God's activity in creation given to us in this book. This isn't just devised by man. These are God's words, written down by man. On the other hand, the naturalist, well, what context does he deal with knowledge and gain knowledge and test things? Well, a naturalist would say, given the knowledge and power, all natural phenomena could be explained and repeated. So if we had enough time, if we had enough knowledge, if we had enough power, we could, recondense the old gas cloud there that formed our sun and the whole thing. That's the source of knowledge. We've got to be able to test it, repeat it. This idea of having to depend on God to tell you it that's outside the idea, the possibility for a naturalist. Now, all of these positions are, one, you can see, totally antithetical to one another. And none of these things, I would submit to you, especially as we're thinking from a scientific perspective, none of these positions can be proven. They are assumed, they are accepted by faith. Given that, for example, that set of assumptions, I then look into God's Word and I look at the phenomena around me and I try to be consistent and come up with an explanation. Using natural explanations as well as God's revealed Word to try and propose, it happened this way. This is the way the world has progressed since God created it, and so forth. These are positions of faith. I'm using this term evolution, and I want us to all be on the same page because there's a lot of different even brands of evolution, and evolution can refer to different processes. What we're going to be speaking about tonight is evolution related to life. Now, they use the word evolution to talk about the evolution of stars and everything else too. Evolution of religion, evolution of societies. We're going to be narrowing our focus on the evolution of life, okay? And the standard definition for evolution is that it's a gradual process of biological change directed by natural selection. Now, a lot of people think that the theory of evolution was this unique new idea that Darwin had. That is not the case. Evolution has been around since the Babylonians. I mean, even before that, men have been devising ways of explaining this idea of simple things becoming more complex and bigger and better. What Darwin's key addition or contribution to this idea of evolution was natural selection, by natural selection. He proposed a mechanism by which evolution could occur. And what is this natural selection? It's a process of nature. It's a blind. So often you'll hear a program, especially from an evolutionary point of view, and if you didn't know better, you'd think that there was some little thing out there called evolution that had a purpose in mind and was directing events and making sure that we got from fish to lizards and so forth. No, there's no purpose behind it. It is absolute blind nature, but it is a process, and it's also often referred to as survival of the fittest. The idea simply is this, that you've got a population, and this is always important, you've got a group of creatures. And of course, within a population, you've got some with different abilities. And for whatever reason, there forms an environment in which certain abilities are going to give particular individuals with these traits the capacity to reproduce, and others don't get to reproduce. Let's use the example of the giraffe. That's a real popular one. Let's say, there's a drought and there's just not much green stuff left to eat. And so the critters there, the taller ones can eat some of the leaves, but only the tallest ones can get to the highest leaves, and it just lets them survive a few extra days, and then it rains, and a few plants grow, but all the other critters in that herd of pre-giraffe die off. Well, then the tallest ones that had the taller genes, those genes are passed on to their offspring, and the whole herd then sort of is pulled along in this direction of being taller. So it's not necessarily, we say the survival of the fittest. It's not the strongest by our perception. It's whatever is producing the capacity for one creature to survive and produce offspring. That's the mechanism. And this was a powerful explanation. It was a brilliant explanation. And it fits observation, which is important. You got a theory, you got a great idea, it may be very logical, but if you don't have any evidence, if you don't have any observations to support it, well, then it goes by the way of all these other good ideas that don't fit the evidence. One of the things that Darwin looked at were little birds, finches they call them, Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos Islands are about 600 miles west off the coast of Ecuador, right around the equator. And Darwin observed these finch, and as he saw different kinds of birds on different islands, that some of them are separated by 100 miles or more, he noticed that for example, this creature here, it ate cactus seeds, and lo and behold, it had a nice big bill that enabled it to break that seed and get in and get the food. It was well adapted to live on a desert island, of which there are some in the Galapagos. But this creature eats insects, and it had a nice little pointy beak and a flat beak, sort of like a fly catcher, that was better suited for catching insects on the fly or whatever. And Darwin simply thought it through, and he said, the explanation for these birds probably is not God created this one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and then those 4 different species got on the ark, along with thousands of other species, not much different than these, and then this one just happened to end up on some island in the Galapagos, and then this one ended up on the other one, this one ended up on the other one. He proposed that probably these all, once upon a time, belonged to a flock of birds that blew off the coast in a storm or something off of Ecuador, got spread out on these islands, and over time, because of the selective pressures on desert islands versus forest islands and so forth, it was better to have a beak like that, and they survived and passed their traits on. It was better to have a beak like this. Now, these kinds of changes, though we might look at it and go, well, that's a pretty big difference. The fact of the matter is, you know what a beak is? A beak is basically the same stuff that your fingernails are made of. It's a very superficial difference of the shape of a beak, or the color of a feather or something like this. But you know what? These things are all still finch. They're all finch-like birds. But notice the names. I'm not even going to try to pronounce them, but I want you to notice that this species name here is different from the species name here. These are 2 different species according to the way man defines species. But, Moses didn't know anything about species. He never had in his zoology class back there on Mount Sinai the phyla and the class and the order and the genus and all of that. You know what the Bible called the different kinds of the types of creatures that God created? God called them kinds. And Moses wrote down this word kinds. And we must understand that kinds do not mean species in the Bible. And so when in God's Word, let's look at there. Let's look in Genesis chapter 1. On the third day, for example, was the first day that God created living organisms of material. On the third day, in verse 11, it says, "Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good." This word kind is continually repeated. But we dare not read into that word kind our scientific term that we call species. Now, with God's Word apparently indicating that the kinds are going to stay within the kinds. You don't have one kind becoming another kind. And the people reading that to mean species, well, Darwin did an awfully good job of showing, hey, look, the best explanation for this by far is there was a particular species and it turned into what we call different species. Fine. But this does not mean that one kind turned into several different kinds. This, we would submit, are all the same kind. And in fact, the capacity that original flock of finch, whatever they were, had to adapt is crucial in God's purpose in creating life with the ability to adapt. My goodness, if creatures didn't have the capacity to adapt like this, everything would have been extinct long ago. And so far from this contradicting God's Word, this fits perfectly with God's whole command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. My goodness, when you read some of these things, it almost sounds like biology class. There's a term we call speciation, adaptive radiation. This is what's going on here. So this does not in any way, shape, or form contradict God's Word in creating organisms by their kind. Now, often this is referred to as microevolution. Can you see that? Because just as soon as you use the word evolution, and often the idea of microevolution fits with this idea, well, yeah, they're just little tiny micro steps until you finally get from a fish to a lizard. I try to shy away from even just using the term, although it's an accurate way to describe what's going on here, little adaptations or evolutions. But I like the term adaptation of the kinds, within the kinds. Now, to understand the capacity of a kind to adapt and change, look at dogs. You got Great Danes and Chihuahuas. This is the same kind. In fact, we call it, it's the same species even as we identify them. You don't think that if dogs had not been domesticated by man and then adapted so that they could hunt or do whatever they do, and we had just found a Great Dane in some jungle somewhere in Africa and then found a Chihuahua in some place in Mexico, though, that they wouldn't have called them different species? You bet they would have. But see, we know the origin, so they're all Canis familiaris. There's incredible potential for adaptation within the kinds. Darwin demonstrated this thoroughly. Did an excellent job with this and iguanas, tortoises. But then he decided, well, now, if this is a way to explain some of this adaptation of the kind, maybe we can just extrapolate that little process all the way back to explain where everything came from, how we go from a single cell to the diversity of life with the birds and the plants and the fish and everything else. And that we call macroevolution. Now here's a typical kind of a chart that we would find in a textbook. This little word here says is a stem reptile. You ever seen a Gila monster? Sort of a little stumpy, beady little lizard. Something very similar to like a Gila monster. But the proposal from a macroevolutionary perspective is, okay, the reptiles produced over a long period of time all of these different, by any stretch, kinds. We got the snake kind and lizards and birds, crocodiles, turtles, and then all of the dinosaurs that are considered to be relatives of the dinosaurs that are all even gone now. And we even have these little creatures that down here are called therapsids. Well, they became the entire spectrum of mammals, all from a stem Gila monster-like little reptile critter. This is macroevolution. This is obviously kinds becoming different kinds. It's interesting that though there was plenty of evidence to support this idea of adaptation of the kind, and it logically seems to follow that macroevolution then is as a result of many, many little microevolutionary steps, there is virtually no good, hard evidence for example, this whole scenario here, this macroevolution of the reptiles, or macroevolution of various kinds of primitive plants, producing the flowering plants and the gymnosperms and all these different things that we've got with the fantastic variety of any type of creature you want to look at. And it's fascinating just how poor, how porous the evidence is for macroevolution. If macroevolution is true, then what we should be able to find are missing links, are transitional forms from the simple-like creatures sort of changing into all these other varieties that we see with the birds and their feathers and the snakes without their legs and everything else that goes on here. Charles Darwin recognized this problem of not having missing links in the fossil record even before he wrote The Origin of Species. Now it's interesting, most people don't know that Darwin waited about 20 years to actually publish his book. When he was on the Beagle, we referred to this morning, when he was on the Beagle and basically formulating his theory of excuse me, evolution by natural selection. That was in the 30s, 1830s. Well, he published The Origin of Species in the 1850s. What was he doing for 20 years? Well, one of the things that he was doing was he was wisely, listening to his wife. She was a devout believer. And she prevailed on him for decades to not publish his ideas, recognizing the problems that it would present. And understanding, the nature of man, boy, latching onto that, see, the Bible's full of mistakes, and rejecting God's Word. But another man came up with the same ideas, and he was about to publish, and Darwin wanted to get the credit for it, so he went ahead and published The Origin of Species. But imagine now, you've got these ideas, you've pretty much got your theory in place, and for 20 plus years, you're sort of looking for more pieces of evidence that'll fit your theory. So this is a statement born of that waiting and watching when he published his book. But as by this theory innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why don't we find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? He recognized that we should be finding missing links. Well, that was back in the 1800s. So maybe in the 150 years since, we've now found plenty of fossils. We got all kinds of missing links, and it was just we hadn't dug enough. Maybe another explanation is the fossil record is just really incomplete. Sort of like if you watch a movie, 2-hour movie, and the videotape has just been cut up in little pieces, or a trailer. You just get the couple little snippets to tell you what this whole 2-hour movie is going to be like. Well, maybe that's the fossil record. You just get a little piece of history here and there. So that would explain big chunks, missing, all those transitional forms. I won't go into the numbers on this, but the fact of the matter is we now know that the fossil record is a very complete testimony to the organisms that are alive today. So we understand that if something was alive on the earth, it's going to be made into a fossil. So that's not a good explanation. To show you then how incomplete the fossil record actually is, I want to read this statement by one of the leading evolutionists of our day. This man is not a creationist by any means. And Stephen Stanley wrote a book called Microevolution. And essentially what he proposes and what other scientists are more and more in agreement with is that basically evolution doesn't occur at all by this gradualistic model that Darwin proposed, but it occurs in these giant leaps where you virtually, I don't want to mischaracterize it too much, but it's almost like, a lizard lays an egg and out pops a bird. Wow, huge leaps of change over a real short period of time. It's called, by the way, if you hear this word, punctuated equilibrium. Okay, and this is so far from Darwinian evolution. This is the statement that Stephen Stanley made. The known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution. Phyletic evolution is like that branching tree I showed you, accomplishing a major morphological transition. That's big words, but I'm wanting to quote him. But that's talking about a structural change, like a fin turning into a leg, a scale turning into a feather, whatever. Major structural change. And hence, talking about the fossil record now, offers no evidence that the gradualistic model of evolution by natural selection can be valid. Now, how often do you hear that? The fossil record gives no evidence. This man is a paleontologist. In fact, it's the paleontologists who are moving much more in this direction of punctuated equilibrium because, frankly, their field of study in fossils just don't support this idea of creatures becoming more and more complex over a period of time. Doesn't. I want to show you just how incomplete the fossil record is. Why an evolutionist like this would make a statement. The fossil record offers no evidence for the gradualistic model. Now this is taken out of a famous older textbook, and the author puts these skeletons in order to sort of help you see what bones are doing what, okay? And this is the proposed transition of going all the way from the fish to human beings. And I just want to focus on the transition of going from water to land. This is a pretty big move. And as we're going to see, it's also a huge structural change in the skeletal structure. The transition from water to land. And by the way, if you know anything about evolution, this is evolution 101. I mean, everybody knows that fish turned into land creatures. Evolution 101. So it's a given, of course. This is, you might, I don't know how, some of these pictures might be a little tough to see. So we'll give those who want to sleep better conditions for that. Could you turn off those lights? Because I want you to see this. This is a, oh, that's much better. This is a picture of one of these creatures that would fit the description of that Eusthenopteron, that ancestor fish. And the unique thing about it, I mean, at first glance, it might have a little odd tail, but it looks like a fish. But wait a minute, there's this interesting projection from its body. The fin rays don't just stick right out of the body. There's some bones and some flesh, and the fin rays stick out from there. And so the evolutionists go, look at that. This must be what could have turned into a leg. All right, so here's the creature that it turned into. This is considered to be one of the first land creatures. It's an amphibian, okay? It's not a reptile. It's got smooth skin. It lays its eggs in the water. Doesn't have a shell. And this is the skeletal structure of this creature, which absolutely, when we dig up their bones, the fossilized bones, this thing was alive. It's called a trematops. So we've got fossils of this. We've got fossils of the Eusthenopteron. These are graphs of the fossils that we have. Notice what this particular chart is doing is it's taking the bone, labeling it C, and excuse me here, A, and that is the bone that came from this one, which came from that one. So if you take the same letter and case and you follow it through, you'll see the proposal of what this A bone became over time. Here's the fish bones. Here's the trematops bones. And we have these fossils in the fossil record. Well, that is, except, of course, B. B is hypothetical. And we don't really have those bones, but it's pretty tough to imagine going from A to C, so we've got to have something to sort of help our minds move through this process, right? But here's what we have, ladies and gentlemen. In the fossil record, we have the bones of this particular fish. These are the bones that are sticking outside of the body. There's the fin rays. And then these are the bones of the forelimb of the terrestrial creature. And there is absolutely nothing in between in the fossil record to indicate how in the world a fish fin ever became a terrestrial creature leg. With all the ligaments and all the muscles and the nerves and the circulatory system, all that's required for that whole system to work. Nothing in between. Now, I don't know about you, but to just accept that, oh yeah, sure, these bones must have become those bones, is, without evidence, quite a leap of faith. But again, like I told you, this is evolution 101. I mean, everybody that understands anything about evolution knows that the fish crawled out on land. This is the level of evidence we have to support that. Then, another very interesting thing happened back in the mid-1900s. This Eusthenopteron fish that was supposed to have been essentially the ancestor to all land creatures was considered to have been extinct for 100 million years. And then some people were fishing and they caught one. It's called a coelacanth. And after the initial embarrassment, you know, this thing was supposed to have been gone long, long ago, there was great excitement because one of the things that happens when you're studying fossils is all you're getting is information about the bones. You know nothing about the soft tissue. You know nothing about the organs and so forth. And so what you have if you actually catch a living fossil is you have the opportunity to compare the soft tissues. Maybe, you know, this thing has an air bladder that is sort of changing and becoming a lung. Because you realize the entire breathing apparatus of a fish is completely different from a land creature. So they dissected this thing with great interest and hope. And you know what they found? They found that this thing was a fish. And it was as standard a fish as you're going to find, except it did. It had these weird little protuberances. And now we understand by observing them that they use them to sort of hover above the, just a couple of feet above the bottom of the ocean. And they're all over the place. They're not common, but they're not rare either. And I do find it interesting. Remember what I mentioned, that we find that if something is alive, we find it in the fossil record. It's interesting that knowing that up to this point, it was considered that there was none of these kinds of creatures in the fossil record for 100 million years. How did they escape being made into fossils for 100 million years? Well, I submit to you that the problem is these vast periods of time. These things were not around 100 million years ago. And the fossils that were formed and that we've studied were a part of all the rest of the fauna that are around in the world today, and that we sometimes find them buried and their bones are fossilized in the fossil record. Now this change of going from from water to land is a big change. And evolution has no real good evidence to support it, other than it has to have happened that way. But now I want to consider what we would consider really a pretty minor change now. Another standard explanation by the theory of evolution of the little creature called an eohippus. If you were to see this running around in the woods and didn't get a real good look at it, you'd probably just figure it was a dog. But if you got up close, you'd go, wait a minute, that's not a dog. Its teeth were more like horse's teeth. Not exactly, but more like horse's teeth. And you know, its tail is a little different. But this is the standard explanation in evolutionary textbooks of the evolution of our modern horse. You start with this little eohippus 60 million years ago, and over that period of time we have changes especially interesting in the foot, in the toes, till we get to our modern horse. Now I just want to focus on one little part of this proposed scenario. The changes that occurred from this creature that's called Merychippus to this creature called a Pliohippus. And notice what the difference is. This creature's got two toes off to the side, and this one the toes are missing. Now if you remember from the little chart over that span of time, this was an 18 million year process to go from this creature to that creature. 18 million years. I was in a place in eastern Nebraska called the Ashfall fossil beds. It's considered to be one of the best deposits of mammal fossils in the world. It was really interesting. I was doing a conference up there, and people kept asking me, well, what do you think about the Ashfall fossil beds? And I'm going, well, I didn't know what in the world they were even talking about. So finally somebody realized that and took me out there, and the place was closed, and so I got a personal tour from the director of the museum. And he showed me all around. Now, in this fossil bed, we have saber-toothed deer. Any of you guys hunters? How would you like if the deer had fangs? might make sure you keep your distance. Well, as well as antlers. Rhino. You know that North America used to be just covered with rhino, camels, all kinds of creatures that of course aren't here now. But one of the fascinating types of creatures that is buried there are horses. And it's one of the best display of horse fossils I've ever seen anywhere. And this is a picture of, now that's the modern horse, and it's a much larger than these other fossils that we see here. And this was not a fossil. This was just to compare the size of the modern horse with the horses that they uncovered there in this fossil deposit. And here's some of those Merychippus type horses. See the extra toes hanging down off the side. Now the interesting thing about this particular fossil deposit is that apparently a large volcano erupted in Idaho. Comparing the dust in this particular area with some dust from a volcano over in Idaho, they think that it was the same volcano. This is almost 1,000 miles away. And yet when that volcano erupted and the dust spread out over the northern plains, it drifted just like snow. And in this particular area, there are places where it was 9 feet deep. And that's why these fossil deposits were so excellent, because the creatures just breathed in that dust, they suffocated, they died, and they just laid down. So the fossils weren't all torn up. And essentially what they have there is a record of all the different kinds of creatures that lived in that area at that precise time. Within the period of, the curator of the museum said, oh, probably within a period of a couple of weeks, all of these fossils were deposited. This is also part of the display. Look at this one. No side toes. Here's Merychippus, here's Pliohippus. Now, I asked the man point blank, I said, now wait a minute, these were excavated out of the same fossil deposit, right? Right. They were drinking shoulder to shoulder out of the pond when they died, right? Right. You remember, wait a minute, wasn't this an 18 million year process? The fact of the matter is, though, they were adaptations of a particular kind alive at the very same time, drinking out of the same pond. And what might be an explanation for this? Well, one of the things that they considered maybe that area was covered with, in certain areas, were marshy swamps. That fella's going to have a hard time walking through the swamp, isn't he? Like a modern horse now, they can get stuck in a muck hole and literally die. This guy has got built-in snowshoes, or mud flaps, I guess we would call them. If that thing's going to walk around in a marsh, those little side toes will flare right out, and he can walk around in that mucky stuff, can't they? So what do we have essentially here, ladies and gentlemen, is just two adapted species within the kind, one adapted for marsh, and this one is better adapted for running around on the hard plain. And this whole scenario of one evolving into another over millions of years simply isn't supported by the hard, concrete evidence. So that we're talking about huge changes of going from water to land, or relatively minor changes like losing a couple of toes. The proposals that are so standard in our textbooks simply don't measure up with the hard evidence that we have. But you know, whether we're talking about just losing a couple of toes, or if we're talking about fins turning into legs, those kinds of changes are tiny compared to the kinds of changes that evolution requires to go from a puddle of chemicals in a primordial soup somewhere in an ancient earth to a living cell. Now, in Darwin's day, the cell was considered to be a pretty simple thing. So it wasn't a really big stretch. Well, you know, sure, you got somehow or other these little cells formed, and that's how you got life. Well, we know a lot different now about the complexity of a cell. And frankly, to go from a single cell to a human being, to imagine it, is nothing in the sense of probability compared to going from carbon dioxide and methane and ammonia in a puddle somewhere to DNA and RNA and proteins and carbohydrates and everything that is required for a living cell. I want to look at some of the kinds of structures that the simplest cells contain. And remember, these kinds of structures are required by evolution to have formed by chance, molecules bumping into each other, forming chemical bonds to give you these molecules to produce the shapes that ultimately, for example, something as simple as a little hair on a paramecium. You think that's just a little hair? Sort of like a piece of clay that's, no. Get down at the molecular level and we find in a cross-section that there are tubes of proteins that have precipitated upon one another, very similar to how, a water molecule, what is that? It's a tiny little Mickey Mouse shaped 3-atom molecule, right? But boy, they start sticking together and you get the beautiful shape of a snowflake. That's how, for example, these particular little tubelets within the cilia of a paramecium form. They precipitate on one another and they form these tubes, and those tubes slide against one another and cause that hair to wiggle back and forth, powered by a little engine down underneath that's even more complicated than this, and all it's for is to let that little paramecium swim around in a pond. A protein like our friend the antibodies, boy, without these we'd be in trouble, wouldn't we? And yet, this is a little graph of one, but here's a three-dimensional shape. Within this, there are thousands and thousands of atoms perfectly arranged to produce the shape necessary so that this antibody will function to recognize, say, for example, an E. coli circulating in your blood versus a salmonella circulating in your blood versus an influenza virus circulating in your blood. All these different shapes of those antigens, they're called, foreign substances, have to be recognized by the complementary shapes of these antibodies. We have hundreds of thousands of these different shapes, all with their specific function of picking out their specific antigen and then clearing your body of them, hopefully sooner than it takes them to kill you. And then everybody laugh. That's what it is. It's a battle for time. Who gets cleared out first? Here's another molecule that the simplest organisms contain. It's called DNA. DNA is a chemical, and yet it carries information that produces the proteins that do all the functions in your body. Here's another amazing molecule called RNA. It's similar to DNA, but it's also sort of like proteins. It's sort of a combination of the two. And it's the RNA viruses that are giving us so many problems in our current era. These various diseases that we can't seem to cure and that our body has such a hard time fighting tend to be RNA viruses. The flu is an RNA virus. HIV is an RNA virus. So many of these things made of this particular product. By the way, every one of those little dots are atoms, and that whole thing has to be perfectly structured to function in the body. That molecule that I just showed you is about that big, as big as I'm making that red dot right in there. It functions in what's called a machine called a ribosome. That machine reads the information within the cell to produce proteins. Linking amino acids together, it's pretty complicated. What has to happen is the DNA, which has the genetic information, opens up a whole apparatus of proteins, a machine with about 50 different moving parts. Get together, they open this up, they make an RNA message, like a little copy of the DNA, send it out into the cell, and then that ribosome reads it and produces the appropriate protein. If you're a liver cell, you want to make liver enzymes. If you're a hair follicle, you want to make hair. They all have to make those different structures. Now, the simplest thing that DNA has got to be able to do is replicate itself. And yet, in your body, in every one of your cells, except your blood cells, you have about 3 feet of DNA. And how big is your cell? Can't even see it. Got to use a microscope. And yet you've got a string of DNA in there about 3 feet long. How in the world, if your cell is going to divide, does that DNA not get all just tangled up into an unbelievable mess? Well, this is how. The DNA has to package itself before it divides, and this cell gets the instructions and the daughter cell gets the instructions. This little red thing is the DNA, that little double helix shape. It wraps around a ball of proteins and basically cinches it down about this much. The DNA wraps around 2 times. So you take a string and you wrap it around a tennis ball twice. You can see how you're going to bring your string down about like this, right? Well, obviously that's still not short enough. So these little balls with the DNA wrapped around it form a tube, a solenoid-like thing. And that shortens it down even more, but it's still not short enough. Then this tube sort of makes these big loops, and they attach at different points along here. That's still not short enough. Then those big loopy things form what I call the Slinky Effect, and they stack in a big loop like this. So within the chromosome, maybe you've seen pictures of this, on slides. But within that DNA molecule, you've got all these levels of packaging until you get to the double helix here. And what happens then is the cell splits that DNA molecule right down through there. That's an identical DNA molecule to that one, and each cell gets a set of instructions. Now, one of the most difficult problems in recent research to explain or to figure out is how, when we're talking about this cell getting all the information, how does the cell know what information to read? For example, in your eye. Do you know that the information to make liver enzymes, make the enzymes that are digesting your dinner right now, the information is in your eye? That'd be a real problem, wouldn't it? If suddenly your eye just started turning on liver digestive enzymes, your eye would turn into a bag of soup. It would digest your eye. So how does the cell know to only, I'm an eye cell, please, I only want blue pigment genes turning on here, please. How does the cell know how to do this? Well, I think most people are pretty familiar with how computers work. Inside my computer here, I have all kinds of programs and files. But right now, I've just clicked on my creation versus evolution file, and we're looking at that from that incredible pile of information down inside of there. That is a very good example of what your cells are doing. They've got the encyclopedia to make you. All the information in every one of your cells. But what your cell has to do is, look, I'm a liver cell. Let's use the example of a pancreas cell. I'm a pancreas cell. I just want to make insulin. So you go into the hard drive, the DNA, and you click on the file, that is the gene for insulin, and you turn it on and you make insulin. Now, if your pancreas doesn't do that very well, makes too much or not enough, what do you have? You've got diabetes, right? It's a major problem. Just because my cellular apparatus doesn't click on the right file or doesn't know how to find it or it makes too much or too little, yes, it's just like that. Each gene in your chromosome is sort of like an individual file on your computer's hard drive. So let's show you what is required for the cell to be able to do this. Now remember, down inside of there is information that contains the instructions on how to make a protein. Say, for example, an insulin molecule. But what we've discovered in the last 15 years or so is that superimposed, and this is the key idea, it's superimposed on the sets of instructions on the inside. There is another whole series of instructions on the outside of this DNA molecule that the cell is interacting with to know which gene to turn on and which genes to just not mess with. How does it do it? Well, it uses a protein. Proteins are the basic workers in the cell. Now, this is a schematic of this particular protein that's going to turn on the gene that I'm talking about. That purple thing is a zinc atom. That zinc atom holds it all together. If you didn't have enough zinc, what would happen? There'd be no zinc, and this thing would be a floppy mess, and it wouldn't work. So that's why you got to, take your vitamins and trace elements and all that. You are a lot more than just proteins and fat and everything else. Okay, here's a loopy part, and here's a wiggly part, all held together by this zinc atom, and it lies in the groove. It's called. Do you see how DNA sort of almost looks like a screw, like a bolt? Well, it is sort of like a screw shape. But of course, this particular little molecule here isn't a little ribbon either, any more than the DNA is a ribbon. And so now here's a three-dimensional picture of that protein that's going to read the DNA. Every one of those balls represents an atom. And you see how its shape is sort of curved. And a good way to think of it is this. You got this great big long bolt, this DNA molecule that has threading on it. And these little proteins will, almost like a nut on a bolt, be just sort of going through along the threads, spinning up and down all throughout the DNA, looking for the place where every single little atom and every plus and minus charge, and if you're a little familiar with chemistry, every hydrophobic and hydrophilic, all these interactions, everything matches up perfectly. Here's a three-dimensional structure of both the DNA and the protein. And when every nook and cranny perfectly matches, this protein, in a sense, stops. It sits down, and it signals to a bunch of other proteins, hey, this is the spot, this is the gene, turn this on and make whatever the information of this part of the DNA says to make. If it's a pancreas cell, for example, this is the insulin gene. Turn on insulin and make insulin. And what's incredible is, say, for example, this little thing right here, those little atoms right there, if they're out of place, this whole protein may not stop and turn on the insulin gene. If your insulin production isn't proper, you're going to have diabetes. What if instead of insulin, this particular gene was making a little protein that stopped your cell from dividing? You know, your cells are going to divide, but then there's other things that make your cells stop dividing. And this protein has to come along and find the gene to tell this piece of DNA to make its protein and stop the cell from dividing. And it's mutated. And it doesn't have that little methyl group there because this protein is just slightly different from what it should be. And so instead of stopping there and making the growth, stopping this growth factor, it just moves right on and keeps looking. What's going to happen to the cell? It's not going to stop dividing. What do you have? You have a tumor. And if that particular kind of tissue is the kind that lets loose and floats somewhere else and lodges in your lung and then in your kidney, what's that? It's cancer. Ladies and gentlemen, because an atom is out of place at the atomic level required for the control of DNA. And these instructions, the shapes involved in proteins reading DNA molecules, those instructions are superimposed on the outside of the genetic instructions that are buried on the inside. When the scientists of 15 years ago or so really began to recognize, by the way, this is the kind of research that I was involved in. That's why I have some of these three-dimensional pictures and so forth. These are the proteins that we were working with in our laboratory. When scientists realized the level of complexity of genetic control, it's called. I mean, you know, the genetic information is one thing. Controlling it by this superimposing of more information on the outside just really was an exponential leap of complexity. And many, many scientists really did come to the conclusion that, you know what, as we read our fossil record, for goodness sakes, we're talking about life, these simple cells being on the Earth over 3 billion years ago, and frankly, 4 billion years ago, the Earth couldn't support life. So we've had all of this time to go from cells to humans, which I said compared to a pot of chemicals to a cell is nothing. There isn't enough time. There's just not enough time to go from a solution of chemicals on the Earth to the first living organisms. And so then they all just started opening to the Bible, right? Well, then let's find the source of the miracle that produced this. Well, no, that's not the inclination of the natural mind. And so instead, scientists are looking, many of them, to outer space to explain where life came from, because they truly understand, readily admit that there is no explanation for life on this planet. It could not have evolved on this planet. It has to have come from outer space. This is why then, whenever you hear about the latest discoveries and all the probes and everything we're shooting out into space, what's the first thing they talk about? Did they find any water? Why? Well, you'd think that H2O equals DNA proteins, RNA, carbohydrates, and lipids. It's incredible to think that because you've got a water molecule, well, now we've got life. But, you see, in spite of all of the problems, when a person believes with all their heart, when a person has convinced themselves that there is no God, there is no creator out there responsible for all this, man is going to have to come up with some explanation. Now, 20 years ago, if some professor had gotten up in some big symposium, some seminar, and basically said, now listen, ladies and gentlemen, let's face it, there's no good explanation for life on Earth. It had to have come from outer space. He would have been laughed out of the stage. He would have lost his grant money. They probably would have figured out a way to take his tenure away. And that'd be a miracle. But now, this is a accepted, widely held explanation. The SETI project. What was it? What is it? It's still being done. Thankfully, it's not by tax dollars, but still all kinds of foundations are funding the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Trying to maybe hear if from some distant star there's a series of numbers that aren't random, indicating that there's intelligence out there. 1, 3, 5, 7, 11. Intelligence! When in their brain, they are using cells to make the microscopes and the telescopes filled with 3 feet of the most fantastic, non-random explanation of how to make a human body that one could ever even possibly imagine. Their brains are screaming intelligence. At least the little cells inside, the DNA inside is screaming intelligence. But you see, man refuses. Man refuses to accept the truth, even though God has made it evident to everyone. And so I think this is a marvelous example of the truth of Romans 1:21. Professing to be wise, they became fools. This is the extent to which man will go to deny the Creator, to deny their accountability to a Creator. And so I want to conclude by really proposing that evolution is not going to go away. It's been around a long time before Darwin, and though even Darwin's mechanism of evolution by natural selection may disappear, evolution is not going to go away. And that is because it is so appealing to the natural mind. Why? One, it relieves the feeling of accountability to the Creator God. If I can just convince myself that God did not create me, then, I don't feel like I'm going to have to answer to this God. And that is a powerful motivation. 2, it can justify a selfish lifestyle. After all, it's survival of the fittest, right? I mean, if I can get away with this lie at work and get ahead, hey man, that's how we got out of the trees. Look at those stupid chimps, I mean, if they just figured out how to use tools and everything, look where they would have been. We can justify abortion. We can justify homosexuality. We can justify lying, cheating. We can justify anything because after all, it's just survival of the fittest, man, and who's going to look out for me? That's how we got here. But it's not just the nasty, atheistic evolutionists that struggle with, especially that part, is it? Selfish living. Because we, even those Bible-believing, blood-bought saints in this room, we struggle with selfishness, don't we? Looking out for number 1, survival of the fittest. But to live by faith is to deny what we observe everywhere we look in this world. I mean, it is a powerful, powerful tool of the flesh. Just look around and see what it takes to survive. Survival of the fittest. But living by faith is denying that. Denying the flesh. Denying what appears to work everywhere we look around us. This is what the Lord Jesus said. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. You want to enter into the survival of the fittest game? Guess what? You are going to lose in the end. Oh, you may think that you're getting ahead now, but you will lose. But whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. He who by faith dies daily, picking up his cross and following Christ, and deferring, and giving in when, I could get away with this. To live selflessly is to deny the survival of the fittest. It's not to live like the animals. And that's what God expects of us. We are not animals.